Good evening, everyone. I am Livia Alexander, Thinking Food Futures co-curator, along with Ishin Anul. On behalf of Residency Unlimited, we are pleased to welcome you to our two-day virtual symposium and exhibition tackling what we consider one of the most urgent questions of our time. How do we feed ourselves given the intensifying challenges of climate change and food insecurity? For today's last session of the day, I should say, we will be inviting artist Siri Lee to present her work. She will be reading from her illustrated digital book, Cao, which I know I'm not pronouncing as perfectly as Siri does in Chinese. Cao, A History of Chinese Discourse Through Famine and Revolution. In his book, After Nature, Jedediah Purdy writes, imagination is intensely practical. A new way of seeing the world can be a way of valuing it, a way of acting personally, politically, and legally that has and will shape the world in concrete ways. Siri will be sharing with us not only the power of imagination, but the power of narrative and creative work as potent tools for social adaptation to combat the strictures of China's state ideology and the very concrete rumbling of a starving stomach challenged by famine. Siri is an interdisciplinary visual storyteller who constructs image-based narratives that move through the personal, historical, and fictional. Her practice is inspired by her upbringing in China and in the US, and an academic background that crosses literary studies, digital media studies, and the social sciences. In visualizing analogies between material culture and ideology, her work addresses trauma, ideology, biopower, and memory, while employing a potpourri of visual and literary strategies. I am very pleased to welcome Siri to carry out the reading of her book. Before we begin, I actually also would like to mention two things, because through this entire day, I have not been thanking enough our curatorial assistant, Shana Yoshida, and I want to just take a moment to do so, and in making this entire event so seamlessly possible and running so well. And I also want to add that in addition to the reading this evening, Siri will be launching a brand new project called Drugscapes as part of the exhibition that will be opening on Friday. And I invite you all to come back on Friday to see this new work, which I am sure will be inspired by your engagement today with Siri's Cao. So Siri, I would love to invite you to turn on your camera and begin the reading.
Hello. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And yes, thank you also to Ishin and Shana for making this event possible. Right now, I'm not sure if I'm actually viewable on screen. Am I? Just making sure. Okay, I'm assuming that I am visible right now. I will just get to sharing my screen then.
Mm-hmm. Yes, you are visible, Siri. We just can't see your screen yet.
Okay, cool. It says I cannot share start screen share while the other participant is sharing.
Give us 1 second.
I wasn't aware.
Cool.
I wasn't aware of the fact that it was still that screen there.
Cool. Okay. Is all well?
Excellent.
I'll just start then. So what you see here is a newly created digital prologue to my print artist book, Cao. And for today, I will be reading this prologue at my own pace and skipping around a bit for the purposes of this event. But this project will also be made available at the Food Futures virtual exhibition that Livia just mentioned, where you will be able to read through it at your own pace. You're welcome to read through it at your own pace with some additional musical accompaniment. But without further ado, let's begin. From 1958 to 1962, anywhere between 17 and 55 million people died in mainland China from famine. From 1966 to 1976, anywhere between 750,000 and 8 million died again in revolutionary violence. In this same time period, more than 40 billion volumes of political writings by the country's paramount leader were printed and recited across the nation. The variation in these estimates does not explain, though perhaps is explained by, the ongoing absence of these massive historical traumas from public memory and discourse, both in mainland China and beyond its firewalls. Nor do they explain how such astronomical physical and intellectual privation could have been possible. The figures and stories from those decades seem so high as to be absurd, stranger than fiction. Could it really be true that so many people starved to death, that students beat their teachers to death, that a single man could have been so revered? And what does it mean to attempt to imagine how all this could have been, over 40 years after the fact, when we have supposedly left all this hunger, violence, and fanaticism behind? By reconstructing a narrative out of archival materials, Zhao imagines answers to these questions the only way such a retrospective can, through collage, parody, and conspiracy, in other words, through strange fiction. Zhao, A History of Chinese Discourse Through Famine and Revolution, by me. A friendly authorial note before we begin in earnest. This work speaks in many tones and tongues. Dark blue is for an authorial voice, to whom it belongs is up to readerly interpretation. Red is for political language used by Chinese state or state-backed organs and officials, as well as their translations and paraphrasings. Yellow is for snide commentary, the handwritten spin-off being snide notes. And a further note that this color coding is only loosely binding. Disclaimer: this is a work of faction. Names, characters, businesses, persecutions, places, events, locales, and incidents are either the produce of the political imagination or used in a factitious manner. Any resemblance to actual or fabricated events or persons, living, dead, or ghost, is purely coincident. Although the author has made every effort to ensure that the information in this book was up to date at press time, the author hereby disclaims any liability to any party for any loss, damage, or disruption caused by their errors or omissions, whether such errors or omissions result from negligence, accident, conspiracy, or any other concoction. So let's hop on board, shall we? 悯农其二，李绅。春种一粒粟，秋收万颗子。四海无闲田，农夫犹饿死。Pity the Peasant, Part 2. 李绅. A single grain of millet sown in spring, by autumn yields a harvest multiplied. All across the land no field lies barren, yet the peasants still from starvation die. Not long ago, I rediscovered this quatrain in my old copy of the 300 Tang poems, 唐诗300首, a staple of any elementary schooler's education in China. The key underneath helpfully notes that this poem, written in 799 AD, profoundly exposed the landlord class's cruel exploitation of the peasants. Now, you might think such trailblazing insight would have seared itself into my 7-year-old brain, but I don't remember much of this composition at all. The second half of a pair, this poem is overshadowed in my memory by its more child-friendly precursor, which addressed the hardship of peasants without ending on their deaths. But I'm old enough now, and enough has happened since, for me to want to dwell a bit more deeply on this neglected postscript. So let's seek out the last time the scene depicted in this poem unfolded. We won't have to dig too deep, just some 60 years. For our first picking, let's click and see what mainland China's most widely used encyclopedia, 百度百科, has to say. And here we are. To very briefly translate, summarize, and fill in the soft-pedaled blanks, the Great Leap Forward, 大跃进, was a radical leftist economic and social campaign led by the Chinese Communist Party from 1958 to 1962. Through industrialization and collectivization, it promised to catapult China from an impoverished agrarian society into full-on socialist utopia. However, owing to faulty policies, exaggerated reports, and censorship of unfavorable developments, food production and distribution fell drastically and led to the Great Chinese Famine instead, which took tens of millions of lives. Bonus fun features of the Great Leap Forward included the outlawing of private farming as counter-revolutionary, public struggle sessions, and forced labor. But of all things in the article, the section that spoke to me the most came at the end. Yes, I do have questions. Going back to an earlier section, 后果及评价, consequences and assessments. Quote, Eastern and Western sources show that the number of dead totaled approximately 20 million people, the main cause being starvation. A portion of scholars also believe this is the most severe famine in human history. Now, never mind for the moment that 20 million is up to 35 million lower than other scholarly estimates, or that it doesn't address the additional shortfall of 30 to 40 million births during the time of the famine. Never mind all that for the moment. What was it like to be one of these numbers? What was it like to live with these consequences? Now, this is a footnote about the ongoing censorship of this article at Baidu Baike, which you can read at your leisure in the online exhibition. But footnote or no, I'm trying to imagine how it was, or even wasn't like. What or how it could have been. Could you believe that a slogan then was, the agricultural yield will be as high as the people are bold? 人有多大胆，地有多大产. Could you believe that the party decreed that from 1957 to 1959, grain production would rise from 195 billion kilos to 525 billion? Could you believe that around 20 million people, mostly rural farmers, starved to death in the midst of these projected yields? And just to note that this information has since been redacted from the Baidu article that I'm screenshotting here. What about 55.6 million deaths? Could you believe their deaths were launched by a single man? A single party? Could you imagine what it was like to starve then? How the trees looked after being chewed of all their bark? What some parents were really eating? And could you believe this hunger's helmsman is still officially and popularly remembered and revered? A different Baidu article lists Mao Zedong's historical contributions as 1. Mao Zedong guided China onto the path of socialist development and established the basic system of socialism. 2. Mao Zedong led the Chinese people onto the constructive road of socialist modernization and launched a new era of realizing the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation along the socialist road. 3, he initiated a new era in which the people are the masters of their affairs and launched the arduous and winding exploration of socialist democracy's realization. I mean, it goes on, but you get it, right? Basically, Comrade Mao is a national hero because he's the reason we, the party, are still in power and able to enforce quote-unquote socialism with quote-unquote Chinese characteristics. And I'll just end this section with Baidu's character evaluation for Mao Zedong. Quote, although Mao Zedong made serious mistakes in his later years, looking at his entire life, his indisputable contributions to the Chinese Revolution far outweigh his faults. And by serious mistakes, by the way, they might mean his incitation of the unprecedented famine that killed 20 to 50 million Chinese that we just talked about, or his subsequent spearheading of the ubiquitous violence and persecution of the Cultural Revolution, which left yet more millions dead. Maybe, uncertain if that's exactly what they mean. But regardless, his merits are first, his mistakes second. He is still adored and respected by the Chinese people. As the evolutionary product of Marxism in China, Mao Zedong thought is still the guiding ideology of the Communist Party of China. When you see a state-commissioned painting like this, do you believe it? How about this one, painted by the Dapu river commune mentor and authentic peasant, Cui Fengde? Our 2019 version, painted by yours truly. How persuasive are photos? Thousands of them. Pop multiple choice quiz. 张小三蒸完皮，搬个梯子到地里，高粱穗上来玩耍，又扭秧歌又唱戏。Now, basically, this is a poem about the pictured child, 张小三, frolicking on top of a field of crops. The political message behind this is that during the Great Leap Forward, the crops were allegedly so thick and dense that they could bear the weight of children dancing and playing on top of them. Hashtag no filter. Now, you are welcome to take on this multiple choice pop quiz to test your knowledge about the labor of propaganda and vice versa at the virtual exhibition later on. But for this reading, we will be moving on. Extra credit. Is this production or performance? A, this is production. B, this is performance. C, this is a trick question. D, this is a conspiracy. So to return to our original question, what was or wasn't the Great Leap Forward like? The Cultural Revolution is one possible answer. Lingua culture is another. Now, what may lingua culture be? You can find out by reading the rest of the book online at this link right here, where I've uploaded the entire 300 plus pages of the book for a more traditional reading experience. Anyways, thank you for joining me, and I look forward to any questions you may have. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Siri, for this wonderful presentation. I actually have seen over and over now, and I never find it boring. It's so engaging and so informative at the same time. I'd like to ask you one question that I always wanted to ask. We didn't have a chance to speak about this before, and I'd like to ask a question that I did ask, but I want also the audience. I think they might be interested in the answer. One is about these big numbers differences you are mentioning at the very beginning, like huge amount of numbers, like from 20 to 50 million sort of, and it is unknown how many people died. And so this is an interesting information, of course. So on one hand, of course, it is about how is it possible, like how on the earth all the families who lost these people cannot make it visible up until today. So this is one of the questions. And the other one is, tackling with future is almost always about dealing with present and future, of course. And in very present time, just like everywhere else in our globe, China had another traumatic experience with the pandemic, and there were again these number of people, the death tolls that we talked about. Does this create any sort of question about reliability of the state sources, how many people actually did die, etc.? And does your presentation or this work address any of those questions in an invisible way, I would ask?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that very nice question. I think to the first part of it about the sort of the variation in the numbers, the estimated death toll, well, in fact, the general scholarly consensus is that it's around 30 million deaths. The number that I would put forward in a non-artistic context, in more like an academic or political argument, would be 36 million. That's the number that was dug up by a news reporter at the Chinese state-run Xinhua news agency, Yang Jisheng. He wrote like a 1,200 page book on the Great Chinese Famine, on the Great Leap Forward. And that was the toll that he arrived at after gaining special access to the state archives that, only a state-sponsored news reporter could really have access to. So he's sort of the one I would trust. But the reason why I like to emphasize the range of statistics is to show that at one level, it's so difficult to really understand what the period was like. You can put a number on it, but the lived experience is impossible to reach through these estimates. And another thing is that it also, from a non-academic standpoint, it doesn't really matter if it was 20 million people or 55 million people, because that's even the lowest estimate you could come up with is still astronomical. And it doesn't, at that point, like arguing over what 1 million more or 5 million more or less that's not the question that I'm interested in trying to tackle. So yeah, that's the answer to your first question. And I think the second question about how it reflects now in terms of statistics, I mean, I would certainly not trust the statistics that come out of the Chinese government, just as a matter of course. Like, they can't even release the statistics from, a famine that occurred like 60, 50 years ago. Like, I would not trust the statistics that they would release about a pandemic now. On the other hand, I think for me, it's once again, it's less about statistics and more about the general ideology of the time that I feel is continuing. This sort of, what we see now is a resurgence of the cult of personality that I think of as really one of the main factors in making the famine so as awful as it was. And we see that coming back into vogue with Xi Jinping. And we also see that coming into vogue in the US. So I think it's for me, it's less about the statistics and more about sort of the way in which people come to view the world, that when statistics are really only something that comes after the fact.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much.
I would add though that this question of like the cult of personality coming into, I would argue it's always been there, right? It's part of modern society. It's part of modern ideology, so to speak, especially now with the celebrity culture. Mm-hmm. So I would argue maybe it's never gone away. But we have also a question in the chat that I just want to make sure we read from. It's a small group of people. Do you want to just ask your question? Or you prefer I read it? Okay, I'll ask it. So Yi is asking, I wonder what drives your interest in the topic of the Great Famine.
Yeah, so what interests me is because I grew up listening to stories from like my relatives and my mom, who was born at the height of the famine, about what it was like to be like a so-called like famine baby, and how people survived or didn't during that time period. And so, and another, I guess, important aspect of that is I would also be learning about like the Tiananmen massacre, which also people in my family participated in and witnessed. And so that sort of, the authoritarianism and the hunger have always been in my consciousness and in my understanding of my relationship to mainland China. And so I've always just been fascinated by what I saw as the more I looked into it, the more I was fascinated by the contradiction between what people could say and what people thought at the time, and what were the real material conditions of living. And it was that gap between ideology and bodily experience that really fascinated me about it. And it was just, and doing this research was really a way for me to figure out what like what way I could understand that time period, because I didn't grow up during the famine. It was my relatives who grew up during the famine, and like I have no way of, you know, I'm not going to even try to like, you know, understand what the experience was like to have that sort of hunger, but to try to, through this book was my way of trying to see how I could understand it. And the method I arrived at was through looking at all of these archival sources and through like kind of just like staring at them long enough to see if like I could see something, or like putting them next to each other, to see if there would be some sort of like window or some sort of what is it, crevice, I guess, to look through.
One of the issues that I know you spoke about just beautifully and eloquently in the past, that I've always found very intriguing, is this connection that you have mentioned between eating disorders, you know, starvation vis-a-vis bulimia, and how it relates to political, like that kind of parallels that you see between kind of eating habits and patterns, access to food, lack of access to food, to kind of this idea of political disorders as a parallel to eating disorders. I just wonder if it's something you can maybe talk about a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, that really started with this book, because it came extremely naturally from this book, where you see like all the propaganda of the time period was about how people were like both, you know, reaching new heights of socialist liberation and thought at the same time as they were also like had an avalanche of like wheat and, you know, crops to feast on, and for like babies to bounce on. So it was that connection between intellectual and material experience was made for me in a way by the propaganda of the time period. And it was more, my job was more to show how like the connection was made and it was a false equivalence, or how it was, or how one sort of like intellectual so-called overproduction was also parallel, like the overproduction of what rhetoric about abundance was tied to the underproduction of the actual things that they were saying were happening. And so that connection was kind of what has led me to also look at the US in ways, and to just try to think of the US also as like a bulimic economy. It's not quite the same, and I can't say like I've, you know, figured out like a way of like saying like, oh, this is the intellectual equivalent of some sort of eating disorder, but it's just something that I've come to notice, the ways in which like people's relationships to material goods are ways of like the physical embodiment is reflected in the political language around it, and how people like try to like a lot of I think the moments I look at are when that rhetoric is really separated, divorced from the reality on the ground. And that's, for me, those are the moments that I find the most revelatory.
I have a question about the artistic strategy that you employ here. Primarily, we are talking about source of information that is not necessarily reliable. That's why you have to dig in a lot of archives, etc. But you also would like to create that sort of question of reliability in the information that is provided by this work. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, but the language itself, it actually sounds very convincing. But from time to time, you remind us that the people you mentioned, the dates you mentioned might not be true, or the translations even that is there cannot be promised to be true, etc. Why do you want to create that with the work, I wonder?
I think it's, I feel like it's an approach that comes just from looking at all this propaganda where they're telling you like, this is true because we've made all these paintings of it and we've made all these photos of, you know, of people like in communal kitchens eating happily. And so for me, it's like, after looking at all of that, it becomes impossible for me to try to also put forward my own sort of my own conclusions as matter of fact, because I think like this project, at least for me, was very much about like trying to like, how do you find ground to stand on when you feel like, when the very thing you're fighting against is like calling itself stable ground, right? And how do you come to a stable conclusion when the very thing you're fighting against is like saying like, no, you do not have the sort of the absolute hold, a monopoly on, you know, what you view as historical truth. So for me to then just say, well, this is really the historical truth, seems kind of to, that seems like a self-defeating sort of approach. So what I would rather do is just to show you all the things that I can dig up from that time period. And it's really it's really a personal approach of saying like, I believe this, but it's not saying like, therefore, like this is the truth, like by an academic proof or anything like that. For me, it's more, the reason why I believe it is because of all the stuff that I've seen and that I try to put into the book, but also because of these like personal experiences that I just talked about like listening about how it was like to like only have cabbage to eat, you know, while growing up. And that's something that it's those personal experiences that are really impossible to just tell people about and make them just, you know, assume your experiences. And so yeah, the book, I think at a certain point it has there is a certain like exasperation maybe about like, how can I convince you of this thing that I know is true, but that I also know that there are all these things that are perhaps more convincing to you because I'm coming at it from a subjective standpoint. And that's why I call it like a work of fact and fiction, just because it's like it's not trying to be just a work of fact.
Either of that. Thank you. Would anyone else actually like to? Please feel free to turn on your cameras if you wish and microphones and be with us if you have any questions to Siri about this work.
Hi, Siri. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
As always, it's fascinating. And this could be really weird off the topic, but just because how the people are so squeezed in terms of livelihood, right? And then they suspect that there are like maybe huge reserves someplace else. In usually kind of this the famine case, true or not. But yeah, I'm kind of curious if you know any of how people might have rebelled against the system of government, like similar to maybe like rice riots in Japan, like 1980 or 20s. Like a breaking down point. It's like break down assault, that sort of level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there were like these kind of scattered incidents where people would try to take over like grain silos or to get into the repositories, but they were and what I found is that they were like shot on sight basically. So the whole thing was cast as like, one of the sayings that really sticks with me from this was like, the grain problem is an ideological problem. And that was the idea, was like, if you're hungry, it's because you're unpatriotic. So the whole framing of it made it so that it became very difficult politically and materially for people to like say that they were hungry and that it wasn't their fault. And so what happened was basically that, you had isolated incidents of peasants trying to make do. But there were even like cases where peasants, like collective farming was not working out. So there were some peasants who tried to go back to like more private farming, like just cultivating enough food for them to subsist on. And that was also deemed counter-revolutionary. So there really was not much space for peasants to really resist. There was a time period during the famine, actually, in like 1961, where the party convened like a meeting and was like, peasants are starving to death, we need to do something. And the idea was proposed that you could have like these, what were they called? Like private responsibility plots, where it was basically saying like, okay, peasants you can cultivate your own food as an emergency measure so that you don't starve. And then Mao Zedong was like no, like that's counter-revolutionary, and he like prohibited that again, and he also like basically ousted the other like high-level generals who were saying that the famine was a reality. And then the famine went on for like another year and a half before people were finally like, no, like this needs to stop. Yeah, there were incidents, and it was just it was also just very insidious, because a lot of the times like acute resistance and rebellion can happen in the cities, but the government was also very strategic in that it made sure that peasants starved before urban dwellers did. So it was about like satisfying urban demand so that political dissent could not gather in cities, and so at the expense of the countryside. So yeah, very hypocritical for a revolution that said that it was for the peasants, but that was the strategy.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think that what it raises, though, an interesting question though about today, right? Because today, again, to the best of my knowledge, which is limited, I always say that, but China is probably suffering from one of the biggest challenges of soil pollution and of soil being contaminated, right? So how, I'm just kind of wondering how, because that kind of grip of the Chinese government, is it still there? Is it not there? Like how, that the challenges to peasants are still there. They just take on a different form maybe today. And yeah. I'm just wondering, are people still, then does that mean that peasants are still hungry? Because again, China still has a very large portion of its production, its rural production is local, is small farms.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think like even now, it's definitely a case where like people in less positions of power in China are kind of shoved around wherever the government wants them to go. This is the case for like people who are like urban migrants and who migrate to the cities from the countryside, and this is the case for people like who are living along like Three Gorges Dam, for example, who got just displaced because the government wanted to build a dam there. So it's not so yeah, I would certainly say it's the case, but it's just that it's not it's very difficult to build a mass movement around resisting that sort of like shifting around, because I mean, for one, there's still the hukou system, which makes it like very hard for people to like leave their hometowns and establish lives in like other places, like start again in other places, are like places where there are more opportunities, for example, in China. And then there's just, I mean, it's also very difficult to organize or to unionize. So I would say that yeah, the sort of the devaluing of people on the margins has always been the case. It just takes different forms now.
We have any other questions from the audience?
So I think it's a good point to end our today's events. Tomorrow we will continue. You're most welcome to join us. Thank you so much, Siri. Thank you all of you.
Thanks, Yuko. Thank you.
Thank you.